Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive? We're tackling some really interesting research about the American working class today.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it is. We're going to be looking at this whole idea of a class divide versus a political divide, And honestly, it's already making me question some of my own assumptions.
Yeah, I think that's what's so great about this topic.
Yeah.
It really challenges how we think about these divisions. Like, are they real? Or just something we're told?
Right. So for this deep dive, our source material is this awesome interview with Batya Ungar-Sargon. She's a journalist, wrote a whole book about this. She traveled all around the country talking to working class Americans.
Oh, I've heard of her. And her book.
Yeah, and the interview we're looking at is on that Trigonometry YouTube channel. You know the one.
Yep, I've seen a few of their interviews. They're really interesting. Always asking the tough questions.
Totally. And they don't shy away from controversial topics. So Ungar-Sargon starts by arguing that this whole idea of America being super polarized, like red state versus blue state, it's kind of a fake idea, like it's something the elites made up. What do you make of that? I think she's onto something.
I don't know if I'd say it's entirely made up. Like, there are real differences in how people think, right? But I do think maybe those differences get exaggerated. Like, maybe we're being tricked into thinking we're more divided than we actually are.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like everyone's in their own corner shouting and no one's listening to each other anymore. Maybe we're missing the stuff we agree on, the common ground.
Exactly. And that's what Ungar-Sargon found in her research. She talked to all these working class Americans, and she found a lot of agreement on some of the big controversial issues, like abortion, for example. She actually has polling data that shows that most Americans, like 65% of those who identify as pro-choice, only want abortion to be legal in the first trimester.
Wow, 65%. Really? It's a lot higher than I would have thought. I feel like you never hear that side of the story.
Right. And it's the same on the other side of the issue. 92% of people who identify as pro-life actually believe that there should be exceptions for things like rape and incest, or if the mother's health is in danger.
That's wild. So there's actually a ton of overlap there, but no one's talking about it.
It really makes you think, right? Like,
Yeah.
that maybe the loudest voices are drowning out everyone else.
Yeah, and it's not just abortion, right? Ungar-Sargon found a similar thing with guns. Most people seem to support the right to own guns, but they also want some common sense gun control measures in place.
Absolutely. It's like, why is this even a debate? It seems like most people agree.
Right. So what's going on here? Why are we stuck in this all or nothing argument?
I think it's partly because of how these issues get framed by, like, the media and politicians,
Yeah.
It's all fear-mongering. They want you to be scared so you'll vote for them.
Yeah, it's like they're not even trying to solve the problem. They just want to keep everyone fighting.
And you know who they usually target with that fear-mongering? The working class. It's like they think working class people are just single-issue voters, obsessed with guns and abortion, or that they're easily manipulated.
Right. It's like they're saying they're not smart enough to think for themselves.
Exactly. Ungar-Sargon says that's a big stereotype. She argues that the working class has complex views that are often ignored.
Okay, so let's talk about immigration then. Another hot button issue. Seems like everyone's got a strong opinion on that.
Yeah, and here's where things get really interesting. Ungar-Sargon says that a lot of working class Americans across all races and ethnicities actually want less immigration.
Wow, really? You don't hear that very often. And that seems to go against both of the major political parties, doesn't it?
Totally. So maybe the working class is more united on some issues than we think, even if their views don't line up with the Democrats or the Republicans. And this is where that whole class divide thing comes in. Ungar-Sargon says the real division isn't Democrat versus Republican, but working class versus elites.
This class divide idea is making me think. So you're saying that because I have a college degree, I might be in a different group than someone who doesn't?
Well, it's not just about the degree itself. It's about the whole culture and economic differences that often go along with having a college degree. Ungar-Sargon says the Republican Party is now the party of the multiracial working class, while the Democrats represent, the college-educated elite and what she calls the dependent poor.
Wait, dependent poor? What does that even mean?
She's talking about people who rely on government assistance, people who, for whatever reason, don't have access to good-paying jobs. Ungar-Sargon argues that both the elites and the dependent poor actually benefit from things staying the way they are, but the working class is stuck in the middle.
So they're getting squeezed by policies that help the rich and policies that create dependency.
Exactly. And she gives a really interesting example of how this class divide plays out. She says, look at the gender divide in politics. Women are more likely to have college degrees now, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So that means they're a bigger part of the Democratic Party, while men without college degrees are more likely to vote Republican.
Oh, wow. So you're saying that the class divide has actually created a gender divide?
In a way, yeah. And Ungar-Sargon links all of this back to economic policies that she says have hurt the working class. Policies like NAFTA, for example.
Ah, NAFTA. That was that trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico, right?
Right. And it was supposed to create jobs and boost the economy.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
But it actually led to millions of manufacturing jobs disappearing in the US. And guess who held most of those jobs?
Working class men.
Exactly. And then they were left with fewer options, lower wages. My grandfather actually worked in a factory, supported our whole family.
That's tough.
I wonder how he would felt about all of these changes.
Yeah, makes you think.
And Ungar-Sargon says that these kinds of policies, like NAFTA, have contributed to the decline of the working class and this whole class divide we're talking about. And it wasn't just trade deals, it was also things like cutting funding for vocational training.
So instead of helping people get good jobs that didn't need a college degree, we took those options away.
Basically, yeah. And then, on top of all that, you have more immigrants coming in, creating more competition for the few jobs that are left.
Man, it sounds like the working class got hit from all sides.
And remember, Ungar-Sargon isn't just making this stuff up. She's basing this on what she heard from real working class Americans. People who have seen these policies affect their lives and their communities.
Okay, so we've got this class divide and all these policies that made it worse. But how did this all play out in the world of politics? I guess that's where Donald Trump comes in, right?
Yeah, he's like the poster child for this whole thing. It's crazy how he was able to tap into that frustration. You know, all those working class voters who felt like both parties had forgotten about them.
It's like they were looking for someone who actually got it, someone who understood what they were going through.
Exactly. And Trump was like, hey, I'm an outsider. I'm not part of the establishment. I'm going to shake things up.
Yeah.
And people loved it, especially in those Rust Belt towns that had been hit so hard by those factory closings.
Yeah, those rallies were wild. It felt like he was speaking directly to their pain, their anger at being left behind.
And he talked about bringing back those manufacturing jobs, putting American workers first, taking on those trade deals like NAFTA that a lot of people blamed for their problems.
So he was basically saying, I hear you, I see you, and I'm gonna fight for you.
Exactly. And for a lot of people, that was a powerful message. They'd been ignored for so long, they were desperate for someone to listen.
Did he actually deliver, though? Like, did things actually get better for the working class under Trump?
Well, that's a whole other debate. Ungar-Sargon says that some of his economic policies did help. Like, wages went up, unemployment went down.
So, regardless of what you think about him, there were some positive results.
That's what she argues, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that, even if it's uncomfortable for some people. We can't just ignore facts that don't fit our narrative.
Right. We need to be honest about what worked and what didn't. Okay, so this is all super interesting, but I'm trying to see the bigger picture here. We've talked about the economy, the class divide, but what about America's role in the world? Like, how does the working class view that whole thing?
That's a great question. And Ungar-Sargon talks about this too. It's kind of fascinating, actually. She noticed this contrast. Like, working class folks are often pretty skeptical about getting involved in conflicts overseas, like the war in Ukraine, but then they're super supportive of Israel.
Really? That's interesting. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a few things. One is shared values. A lot of working class Americans, especially from rural areas, they see themselves in Israel in a way.
Like, they admire their strength, their toughness.
Totally. They see Israel as this little country surrounded by enemies, but they're not backing down. They see it as a beacon of democracy in a really tough part of the world.
It's like they feel a kinship.
Exactly. And there's also the religious aspect. Ungar-Sargon talks about how a lot of American Christians, especially evangelicals, have this deep connection to Israel.
Because of the Bible.
Yeah, they see Israel as like the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Like, it's all part of God's plan.
So for them, supporting Israel isn't just politics, it's about their faith.
Exactly. It's another layer of complexity, right?
For sure. So we've got this group that's kind of wary of getting involved in wars overseas, but they're rock solid on Israel. Where does that leave us in terms of America's role in the world?
It feeds into this tension, right? This ongoing debate about what America's foreign policy should be. Should we be America first? Focus on our own problems and stay out of everyone else's business?
Or should we be the world's policeman, stepping in whenever there's trouble?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not always a clear-cut choice. Ungar-Sargon says that a lot of working class folks, they're not isolationists, but they're also tired of seeing America get bogged down in these endless wars.
Yeah, like pick your battles carefully. Don't waste lives and resources on stuff that doesn't directly affect us.
Exactly. And it's a perspective that you don't always hear from those in power. You know, the ones making those decisions about war and peace.
Yeah, it's easy to be hawkish when you're not the one sending your kids off to fight. Okay, so last thing I wanted to bring up. This whole idea that the working class feels ignored by the media. Remember, the hosts of Trigonometry, they asked Ungar-Sargon a pretty pointed question about this.
Oh, yeah.
They basically asked, do you think alternative media is the only way to get real news now? Or can mainstream media still be saved? What do you think? Is mainstream media too far gone?
That's a tough one. I mean, there's no doubt that trust in the media has taken a big hit, and there's some real problems like bias and a lack of objectivity.
Yeah, it feels like every outlet has an agenda these days.
Totally. But I'm not ready to give up on mainstream media completely. I think it can still be salvaged, but it's going to take a lot of work.
Like what kind of work?
Well, they need to be more transparent about their biases, for one thing. And they need to be more accountable for their reporting, you know. Fact check more carefully, admit when they make mistakes, and maybe, most importantly, they need to start listening to those perspectives that they've been ignoring for so long.
Like actually get out of their bubble and talk to people who are different from them.
Exactly. That's why I think Ungar-Sargon's work is so important. She's giving a voice to those who haven't been heard. And she's challenging all of us to think more critically about the information we're consuming.
So what's the main takeaway here? What do we want our listeners to think about after this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we need to be more aware of how class and culture shape our politics. It's not just about left versus right, Democrat versus Republican. There are deeper things going on. And if we want to understand them, we need to listen to those voices that are often marginalized, the ones that get drowned out by the noise.
Yeah, we need to move beyond those tired stereotypes about the working class, the ones that paint them as angry or uneducated or whatever.
Right. Ungar-Sargon is showing us a more nuanced, more human picture of the working class.
It reminds me of something that happened a few weeks ago. I was at a dinner party and I was talking to this guy, works in finance, very successful, and he made this comment about how working class people just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And I was like, dude, are you kidding me?
Oh, man.
It was so tone deaf, like he had no clue about the real struggles people are facing.
That's exactly what Ungar-Sargon is talking about, that kind of dismissive attitude. It just fuels resentment and alienation. It's like, you think you're better than me, you think you understand my life.
And that kind of disconnect can lead to some really bad stuff, right? More polarization, more anger, maybe even violence.
Absolutely. When people feel like they're not being heard, like their voices don't matter, they're going to find other ways to express themselves. And sometimes those ways can be destructive.
So what can we do about it? How do we bridge this gap?
I think the first step is just being more aware of our own biases. We all have them. They're shaped by our experiences, our upbringing, our education.
Like that finance guy at the dinner party, he probably didn't even realize how insensitive he was being.
Exactly. He's coming from a completely different world. And once we understand our own biases, we can start to challenge them. We can start to question those easy narratives that we've been told about other people.
So like, don't just hang out with people who are just like you. Make an effort to connect with people from different backgrounds.
Exactly. Listen to their stories.
Yeah.
Learn from their experiences. And yeah, it might be uncomfortable sometimes. It might challenge your own worldview. But that's how we grow.
It's how we become better people.
And maybe that's the most important lesson from all of this. It's not just about understanding the working class. It's about understanding each other. Recognizing that we're all human beings with hopes and dreams and fears. And even when we disagree, we can still find common ground.
We're all in this together, right?
Right.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing that Ungar-Sargon talked about, and I think it's really important for our listeners. She talked about the importance of critical thinking, especially now, with all the information overload we're dealing with. It's like every day we're bombarded with news and opinions from all sides. It's hard to know what to believe.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming, and that's why critical thinking is so crucial. It's about not just blindly accepting everything you hear, but asking questions, analyzing, thinking for yourself.
Like, who's telling me this? Why are they telling me this? What are they trying to get me to believe?
Exactly. And it's not just about being skeptical of the mainstream media. You have to be critical of everything. Social media, stuff you hear from friends and family, even your own assumptions.
It's like we all have these filters, right? We tend to gravitate towards information that confirms what we already believe.
Totally. It's human nature. But it's also dangerous. If you're not careful, you end up in an echo chamber, surrounded by people who just agree with you all the time.
And you never get challenged, you never grow.
So how do we become better critical thinkers? What are some things we can do?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Well, one thing is to diversify your sources of information. Don't just get your news from one place. Read different newspapers, watch different news channels, listen to different podcasts.
Get out of your comfort zone.
Exactly. And when you come across a piece of information, ask yourself some questions. Who wrote this? What are their credentials? Do they have a hidden agenda? Is there any evidence to back up what they're saying?
It's like being a detective, right? You got to gather all the clues before you can solve the case.
Exactly. And it's not easy. Critical thinking takes effort. You have to be open-minded, willing to be wrong, but it's so important.
And maybe, just maybe, if we can all get better at critical thinking, we can start to overcome some of those divides that Ungar-Sargon talks about. Maybe we can start to have real conversations, find common ground, and be more informed citizens.
That's the hope, that by understanding each other better, by listening to each other's stories, and by really thinking critically about the world around us, we can create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap things up for today. But don't worry, we'll be back soon with another deep dive into the issues that matter most. Thanks for listening.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're all part of the same society, and we all have a stake in making it work.
And that we can't just ignore the problems that are affecting a huge chunk of our population. It's like, if the working class is struggling, eventually everyone's going to feel it.
Right. It's about economic stability, but it's also about social cohesion. When people feel like they're being left behind, that's when you start to see things unravel.
Okay, so we've talked about this class divide in America and how it's playing out in our politics and our culture. But what about solutions? Like, what can we actually do to bridge this gap? Ungar-Sargon talks about a few things, right?
Yeah, she does. One thing she emphasizes is the need for a more robust safety net, like healthcare, childcare, things that can help families get by, especially when times are tough.
Because right now it feels like if you fall through the cracks, you're kind of on your own.
Exactly. And she also talks about the importance of bringing back manufacturing jobs. Like, those were good-paying jobs that didn't require a college degree. They were a pathway to the middle class for a lot of people.
Yeah, my grandfather, the one who worked in the factory, he was able to buy a house, raise a family, all on a factory worker's salary. That's almost impossible now.
Right. And Ungar-Sargon argues that we need to invest in those kinds of jobs again, create opportunities for people who don't have a college degree.
So like trade schools, apprenticeships, things like that.
Exactly. And she also talks about immigration. She says we need to have a more balanced approach, one that takes into account the needs of working class Americans.
Because right now it feels like the only people talking about immigration are like the open borders folks and the hardcore restrictionists.
Yeah, and Ungar-Sargon is saying, hey, there's a middle ground here. We can have a system that's fair and humane, but also protects American workers.
And that's what we're all about here, right? Finding that common ground.
Exactly. It's not about picking sides. It's about having an honest conversation about the challenges we're facing and figuring out how to solve them together.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap things up for today. This has been a super thought-provoking deep dive, and I want to thank you for joining me and sharing your insights.
Thanks for having me. It's a great conversation.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We hope this has given you some food for thought, and we encourage you to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging in these important conversations, because that's how we make progress, right? By talking to each other, listening to each other, and working together to build a better future. See you next time.